sun and rain come round, the sacred life unfolds without so much a sound, to witness such a birth rising from motherhood, a child of life is born. How can we know its worth? Just as the morning sun burns off the chill of night, my soul it stirs in love. It rises from your light, your holy life. It fills the smallest places of earth and sky, for within you all abide. Oh, fill my mind and leave your wondrous traces, transform my life, for my heart is open wide. When winter hides earth's face and chilling winds replace the warmth of summer sun, under its dark embrace I turn my thoughts within. The blade does shoot, and then the full ripe grain appears. New strains of life begin, just as the morning sun burns off the chill of night. My soul it stirs in love. It rises from your light, your holy life. It fills the smallest places of earth and sky, for within you all abide. Oh, fill my mind and leave your wondrous traces, transform my life, for my heart is open wide. Transform my life, for my heart is open wide. Transform my life, for my heart is open wide. All right, today I want to talk about resurrection or resuscitation. So,
I debated a long time on whether or not to talk about this on Easter because I think it's a rather controversial subject, but it's not original necessarily with me, but it's some ideas I just want to throw out there, and I'm not asking you to change your belief or anything. I've been giving Easter talks for 40-some years, and so I thought it was time to maybe change things up just a little bit today and maybe look at some new ideas, or a new idea. It may not be new to you. Jesus made a statement to his disciples. He says, "Where I am going, you cannot come." And this statement was actually made before the crucifixion. John placed it there. But the placement of many of the sayings of Jesus they vary from one gospel to the next. For example, in the Gospel of John, one of the first acts that Jesus did in his ministry was cleanse the temple. Well, Matthew and Luke said that was the last week of his life that he did that. So they took what could have been a historical event, and there's controversy around what it means to cleanse the temple, because the temple covered many acres of land and many acres of area. And so scholars kind of debate on what that meant. Was it a certain part of the temple that this happened, or did it happen at all? They don't really know. But anyway, the statement will take on a different meaning, I think, with today's subject. One thing we have to remember about the gospel writers is they were not journalists. Critical scholars and historians have long understood that while some events recorded in Scripture have their basis in history, the writers commonly used these facts to support their own narrative. The gospel writers were evangelists, not historians, and certainly not journalists. Their purpose for writing was to advance the narrative of the early church rather than produce an accurate account of historical events. And when we read some of the gospel stories, some of the gospel accounts, we don't even think about what's going on when we're reading. One good example is when Jesus was baptized and he went out into the wilderness immediately following that and was tempted by Satan. Well, the Gospel of Mark was the first written around 70 A.D., and all he devotes to that story are about 2 lines, that he went out into the wilderness, he was tempted by Satan, and he was with the beasts of the desert. And that's about all it says. But when you get into the other 2 synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, they go into quite an elaborate story about the 3 temptations and all that we're familiar with. So the question you would ask is, how would anyone know what Jesus went through if he was alone in the desert? We don't know. Mark is probably the closest, most accurate, that he went out in the desert, and perhaps he mentioned it later on that he was tempted or whatever, but I mean, who wouldn't be? If you went out there and what I could imagine is Jesus goes out in the desert after he experiences the baptism, and it's a change of life for him. And he goes out there and he contemplates, he thinks about the life change that he's about to undergo. Well, I can understand that. When I decided to enter ministry, I did something very similar. I spent a lot of time alone and just thinking about what that might be like, and was I really up to it, and all the different questions that came up. But the point is, who would know what Jesus actually went through? But if you read Matthew and Luke, you'll get quite an elaborate story. So that's an embellishment, that he probably did go out in the wilderness. But he, where this story comes from is probably the embellishment of Matthew and Luke. Another example is Gethsemane. He's there with his disciples, It's toward the end of his ministry, and he's undergoing a tremendous thing. He's praying that this cup be removed. He prays 3 times, according to the story, that the cup be removed. That is, we assume that means the forthcoming crucifixion. But the disciples fell asleep when all this was going on. So how do we know what happened? Who was there to record it? And I can't really imagine Jesus necessarily passing on something like this. Again, it would be the embellishment of the writer. Here's what we believe he went through. And then another incident is when he's standing before Pilate. Who would be there to record that conversation? There's nothing in any of the Roman literature that says what happened in the exchange between Jesus and Pilate. When Pilate says, they say you're a king, or are you the king of the Jews? And he says, you say I am. But how would a gospel writer know what that exchange was? And so it's an embellishment, and we have to keep that in mind when we're reading. And most of us will read through the Gospels and just accept them at face value, that this must have happened. But that's not what the writers were. The writers were not journalists. They were not historians. They were telling a story, the story they wanted to tell. And it was a story that probably would have been quite unfamiliar to Jesus if he heard it again, if he were able to hear it. The first gospel that appeared was Mark, and that was 40 years after the death of Jesus. And the story of Jesus was passed on orally, oral tradition, passed on by word of mouth. That whole culture, the whole society was an oral society because most people could not read or write. About 1%, they say, could. So, and that's not unusual. The Australian Aborigine has passed on their story from the beginning of time orally. They don't write. There's a lot of incidents around the world where we find cultures that are oral traditions, and that particular part of the world, the Near East, was an oral society. So from the time Jesus was crucified to the time Mark appeared, a lot had happened. A lot of changes occurred. And the Romans had decided to annihilate the Jews. They engaged in a siege on Jerusalem. They leveled the city. They burned it. They slaughtered everyone in it, everyone they could catch. They burned the temple to the ground. And that happened in 70 AD, and Mark came out right after that. So the writer of Mark would have been pretty traumatized, probably, by the historical events that Jesus knew nothing about, because there was tension between the Jews and the Romans, but not to the extent of what happened. And then about another 60 years later, it happened again, where there was another rebellion. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where the Romans again just slaughtered all of the Jews. The Jews took back Jerusalem for about 3 years, and the Romans regrouped and annihilated most of them, or as many as they possibly could. The historians say it was a worse revolt and worse for the Jewish population than the first revolt. But to understand the historical context out of which the gospel story comes, the writers were addressing questions like, if Jesus was the Messiah, where's the kingdom? Why are the bad guys winning? The Messiah is supposed to take them out, and he hasn't done that. And so the Gospel of Mark one of its purposes was to answer that question. Well, that's the first coming, but he's coming back. That's how they address that problem. And Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark in their Gospels and reiterated that and expanded on that idea. But they came along another 10 and 15 years later. So there was much elaboration from the Gospel of Mark to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And then John came along around 100 AD, much later, and is a totally different tradition. If you put them all side by side, there's only a couple places where they overlap. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic Gospels because they're drawn from a similar source. John is something completely different. So if we remember, keep this in perspective, that these writers, they were not trying to tell us the story of Jesus. They were trying to tell us what the church, how the church understands Jesus. They're reporting on how the church thinks the role of Jesus was played out and what that meant. Jesus himself probably would not have recognized this story. And I can only speculate when I say this, but I do believe this because when you go through the Gospels, you'll find sayings that are attributed to Jesus where they'll say, when's the kingdom coming? He'll say, doesn't come with observation. You can't say it's going to be low here, low there, because the kingdom of God is within you. And he gave several instances where he spoke of the kingdom of God not as something that would be established by Israel, a political, social change, but an inner awakening. If you're not born again, you can't see the kingdom. If you are born again, you can. So that's the thing that we have to keep in mind. These gospel writers are not historians. They're not biographers. They are evangelists. And like evangelists today, turn on the television, look at YouTube, watch some evangelists. They'll tell you the gospel story, not necessarily the story of Jesus historically, because we don't know who he was. There's so little evidence that we have as to who he was that we don't literally know who Jesus was. We just have a very sketchy understanding of who he was. If you want a good presentation of this, it's this 4-part series, From Jesus to Christ. It was put out by Frontline. Excellent series on understanding the historical Jesus, what we know about him, and that's very, very little. But these scholars and historians get together and they're all interviewed and talk about how this whole thing evolved. So where I'm coming from is based on critical scholarship. It's not religious scholarship. It's not coming from the religion about Jesus. I think it's coming from the understanding of Jesus. But I can't prove that. Nobody can prove anything. You know, we say you can prove anything with the Bible. You can find support for almost any belief you have in the Bible. That's true. But it's not consistent. You know, you can say the earth was created in 6 days and God rested on the seventh. You have biblical proof that that happened. But can we really prove that? You know, that's what we always have to keep in mind. The spiritual aspect of that story is valid. I don't know that anybody takes it literally. So my research into the near-death experience has prompted me to raise some interesting questions about the resurrection story of Jesus. For example, death by crucifixion normally took from between 2 days to 2 weeks. The victim would succumb to suffocation or exposure to the elements. Jesus was pronounced dead only 6 hours after he was crucified. And that's a pretty significant fact. In all of the Gospels, I believe at least 3 of them record that he was crucified on the 3rd hour, they say it, and the 3rd hour would be 9 o'clock in the morning. The day began at 6 o'clock in the morning. So the 3rd hour was 9 o'clock. The 6th hour, when they say that darkness came over the earth, that's the 6th hour. And the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, is when he breathed his last. So he was on the cross for 6 hours. What was a common practice for the Romans was to break the legs of anyone they crucified, because in a couple of days they could be pulled down from the cross and survive. So in the case of Jesus, the centurion that was overseeing his crucifixion said he was dead. And so he was kind of the one there, and I'm sure he was quite experienced at that job. But there's something interesting about that man as well that we'll talk about. So when Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for his body, Pilate, an experienced executioner, and he was very experienced, put many people to death, wondered how Jesus could be dead so quickly. He summoned the centurion who had witnessed the crucifixion and made the death pronouncement to confirm it. The centurion, who believed Jesus was an innocent man, assured Pilate that he was indeed dead. It's recorded of the centurion that he confessed that Jesus was the Son of God, that he was an innocent man. So that's another clue that plays into this story. What if Jesus had slipped into a coma or momentarily died and spontaneously resuscitated prior to being entombed? This could explain appearances after his death and serve as a factual basis for the rumors that he had been raised from the dead. When he told his disciples that he was going away, and where I'm going you cannot come, he could have been telling them that he was fleeing the country. They could not go with him. You don't have to believe this. As I said, this is just a presentation of an alternative that I could embrace, because I've always had a problem with someone being dead 3 days and being resurrected. And I know that is one of the basic Christian teachings. But I said a couple of weeks ago, I do not believe in the second coming. I believe in the first coming. I believe Jesus was a spiritual teacher who it was believed that he was put to death by the Romans. But in my studies of the near-death research, I've read about so many cases and listened to people interviewed who underwent something much worse than 6 hours hanging on a cross and came back. People are crushed in automobiles. They are mangled in ways you can't even comprehend. They lose limbs. They have cardiac arrest and their heart stops. They flatline. But they're resuscitated. They come back, and they either do it on their own or they do it in a hospital setting. But for Jesus to be on the cross for 6 hours and die, I could easily see how he could have gone into a coma and been taken down. There was questions from Pilate, is he really dead? I can't believe it. But you've got the centurion that says yes, and maybe the centurion, who thought he was an innocent man, the Son of God, wanted to help save him. I could believe that. I could understand that he'd be risking his life. But he was apparently a trusted guard because Pilate called him in. Joseph of Arimathea, a man of wealth, could have arranged to have Jesus smuggled from the port city of Caesarea or Joppa to another Mediterranean country safer from the long arm of Roman law. And here you see the two red circles, that's Caesarea and Joppa. And that's Jerusalem at the little bit further south, so it's not very far away. So you could imagine them taking him down maybe they thought he was dead, or maybe they thought there was a chance he wouldn't be. Because I would imagine most people were familiar with crucifixion and with how long it should take and all of that stuff. And maybe that's why Joseph was so anxious to approach Pilate and get the body down. They said it was because we don't want to do it during the Sabbath and all that stuff. You know, we want to do it before that. But it could have been a conspiracy. It could have been a well thought out plot to save him. So they take his body down, probably put it on a cart, go to the tomb that is Joseph's, probably on private land. It was Joseph's own tomb, where nobody would be around. Maybe he revived before they got to the tomb, but they went ahead and rolled the stone over to make it look like he was there. Very possible. They took him to Joseph's home or to some safe house for him to be able to recover. If we think about him going to another land, say he left the port of Caesarea or Joppa and was transported to somewhere like Egypt. There's a fellow you probably have never heard of. His name is St. Paul. And it's not the St. Paul that you read about in the Bible. This was the first hermit. Paul of Thebes, commonly known as Paul the first hermit or Paul the anchorite, was an Egyptian saint regarded as the first Christian hermit who was claimed to have lived alone in the desert of Egypt from the age of 16 to the age of 113 years old. He is venerated as a saint by the Catholic Church as well as the Eastern Orthodox Church and Oriental Orthodox churches. I'd never known of this person, but the monastery of St. Paul is there today, and it's built, they think, over the cave where this hermit lived. And he lived during the time of the Roman persecution when the Romans were going directly after the Christians. When Jesus was alive, that wasn't the case. They were not persecuting Christians. They considered them a Jewish sect, and they call them the sect of the Nazarenes, or the followers of the way. But they did not acknowledge them as a separate organization. That this came later, when they actually began to put Christians in the Colosseums, and that was the Saturday night entertainment, was watch them be devoured by wild animals and all that. But the point of this is St. Paul fled the city of Alexandria, fled Roman persecution. And he went to a place here. You can see the orange is where the Roman Empire ruled. And the two yellow dots, you see Jerusalem there, the circle, and then the monastery of St. Paul down in Egypt, right on the west side of the Red Sea, that finger of the Red Sea. That's where that monastery is today. So even he was within the Roman Empire and still hid for all of those years. So it's very possible that Jesus could have been transported to some place like that, or to Africa, or to Alexandria itself, or maybe to Spain, maybe to Italy, maybe to Asia Minor, to Greece. There's many places he probably could have gone and nobody would have known who he was. And he could have lived a very long life. You know, there's a tradition that he went to India, that he did survive the crucifixion and fled to India, spent life there and grew to be an old man. And I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if what I'm saying is true or not. I'm just saying it's a possibility. Because when he appeared to people after he was pronounced dead, he was able to eat fish. He did things to prove that he wasn't a ghost. And that would support the near-death idea, that he was a physical being. But you could imagine that people that may have witnessed the crucifixion, and we don't know how many did, that saw he died, and yet he's not dead. And so the people that would not have seen him resurrect, or maybe many did see him after he was resuscitated. And so that rumor would get around that he was raised from the dead, and he was, probably. And that's what resuscitation means, that we bring somebody back from the dead, basically. Somebody flatlines, doctors revive them. When they flatline, they're dead, clinically dead, often pronounced dead, and are brought back. Back then, they probably knew very little about that, but it probably happened not necessarily as often as it does now, because the science of resuscitation is improving by the year. That's why we're hearing so much more about near-death experiences, because there's more of it. It happens more often. People are revived. They're brought back. And if you go on YouTube and do a search on this, you'll find hundreds of thousands of stories of people. I listen to new ones all week long. Some are pretty strange. Some are fit, that exact profile. But it's said that Jesus died and went to sit at the right hand of God. You can listen to almost any near-death experiencer, and they'll say the same thing. The experience they have is beyond description, beyond words. And so all of this fits. The more I have gotten into that research, the more I could see this as being a possibility. But when he was revived, he was shuffled out of the country, because if the Romans would have found him again, they would have made sure that he was not taken down from the cross until he was dead. So they got him out. And he did perhaps live a solitary life. We don't know. But I would imagine it would have been kept pretty low key if he was anywhere within the reach of the Roman, long arm of the Roman law. So points to consider: Jesus was pronounced dead in 6 hours. A normal crucifixion could take 2 days to 2 weeks. Pilate questioned his death and summoned the centurion who made the pronouncement to confirm it. The centurion believed that Jesus was innocent and that he was the Son of God. This belief could have prompted him to provide cover and assist in Jesus' rescue. Jesus could have been transported to Joseph's home to recover. The stone was placed over the tomb to hide the fact that he was not there. A rumor circulated, and this is found in Matthew, that the disciples intended to steal the body and claim Jesus resurrected. That was a rumor circulating, and there's a name for that conspiracy today. I forget what it is. But it is, that to me wouldn't add up, that they would not have to do that if he was resuscitated. But that if he was resuscitated, it would be a whole different scenario. The morning of the third day, Joseph's servants removed the stone, anticipating someone would be there to anoint the body. And in the case of the biblical accounts, those someones are Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, not the mother of Jesus. The two Marys. They were going to anoint the body, and this would have been an anticipated fact. So Joseph could have sent a servant there or several servants, to roll away the stone so the women could see the tomb was empty, but it was not empty. There was somebody in there. Possibly a servant of Joseph, a young man dressed in white, and that's what Mark says, a young man dressed in white, was assigned to meet the two Marys and inform them that Jesus would see the disciples in Galilee. So that's what happened. Footnotes that you'll find in your Bibles will say the original gospel ended when the two women saw this young man, and he told them what he told them, and they fled, terrified. And it says they told no one. And that's how it ended. But the young man said, he will meet you or tell the disciples he'll meet them in Galilee, as he said. Well, he probably did. Probably met them in Galilee. And he showed them that he was him, that he was still him. But where I'm going, you cannot come. And where is that? I'm not going to tell you, because if you know, you'll be tortured, and they will torture it out of you. But I'm going to be taken out of here, and for your safety, I'm not going to tell you, and you can't go with me. So that would throw a whole new light on that statement. And to me, it would not lessen the power of Easter one iota. It gives me a believable scenario, one I could embrace as true. I don't have to accept on faith. There are many facts that I can relate to today, many stories, many scientific researchers saying we don't die when we flatline. We can be revived, and we can have an incredible experience when this happens. So I like to think that Jesus died an old man, maybe as a hermit someplace, maybe in Egypt, maybe in Africa. Doesn't matter where. But there are plenty of places to hide. This is an intriguing possibility that can provide a factual basis for the resurrection. After all, resurrection and resuscitation both carry the same meaning of bringing one back from the dead. So it's something to think about. And again, it's not something I'm presenting to you as an absolute fact. This is a presentation of a possibility. But it's kind of a different Easter story. Would you not agree? All right. That's all I have to say this year. Thanks for coming out, and hope to see you next week.
watching a talk given by Reverend Doug Bottorff here at Independent Unity in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us spread our message. If you would like to support us, you can do so by clicking the button in the right-hand corner of the video screen. We greatly appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching.